I caught the Central Line train at Lawn, having driven in from Abbey's Roding as I did every morning. There are a number of villages in that area of North Essex with the suffix Roding. They took their name from the River Roding, which, rising in the East Anglian Heights, flowed southward, meandering through the county and changing its name along the way to Barking Creek before adding its waters to the Thames. Roding was sometimes pronounced Rowing, a name going back to Anglo-Saxon times when the river was known as Froda. Those early English speakers pronounced the letter D as th. It's quite remarkable how we live every day on this island alongside reminders of more than 1,000 years of history. It was more convenient to get the train at Lawn, as the car park there had far more room than that at Anchor. The service from Anchor to Epping had, in any case, been suspended in 1994, possibly because few like me used the service. The train journey was simply a time to think, my subconscious ticking off the stations without my having to read the station signs. I had made this journey so many times that looking out of the window was no longer of interest. Same old, same old. The backs of terraced housing built after the line had extended out into Essex, a ribbon of humanity following the railway towards Greenfields, escaping from the grit and grime of London. Once busy goods yards had become crowded car parks at the stations along the line, as this was now commuter land. My ears recognized the clickety-clack as other lines that fanned out into the great suburbia joined the artery that fed me and thousands of others into the mall of commerce that was the city. The whine of the electric motors as the train accelerated, then a roar and pressure on the eardrums as the tube train descended into tunnels scarcely wider than the carriage itself, told me we had just left Leighton. A gradient took us back into the light at Stratford, followed by another descent into the tunnel. None of these distractions took my attention away from the morning paper, yet they were filed in my subconscious sufficiently for me to know exactly where I was without looking out of the window. I did take notice on arrival at Milan, where hundreds left the Central Line, crossing the platform to the District Line, and more hundreds crammed into the spaces they had left until there was standing room only. The next stop was Bath Mill Green, where I would leave. So tightly packed was the carriage that I would start making my way to the doors as soon as the train left Milan. I would push past bodies that were confined by yet other bodies in the close-packed carriage. The ensuing crush forced me into closer proximity with these strangers than any of us would prefer. Briefcases caught in skirts and between legs impeded my progress. At last, I reached the doors just as the train squealed to a halt. With a hiss, the doors slid open and I would push out, fighting against the surge of passengers boarding the train. Walking out of the station into fresh air was a pleasure. The London Underground, by virtue of being the oldest system of underground mass transit in the world, suffered from problems. The most immediate was the lack of air conditioning, but then those Victorian and Edwardian adventurers who built the system couldn't anticipate the advent of that particular convenience, or that so many people would travel on the system. It wasn't far to my office, which was on Old Street, and I enjoyed that short but brisk walk. A door to one side of a newsagent gave access to a steep flight of stairs. The Punjabi immigrant who owned the shop waved cheerily when he saw me, making a show of examining his wristwatch as his comment on my unvarying punctuality. Another door at the top of the stairs allowed entry to the lobby of my office suite. 2 rooms, the larger front room was the office with my desk and filing cabinets, and the other smaller room had become a kitchen with a toilet in the corner. Not exactly a plush suite, but it suited me as I had no staff. My briefcase was placed to the side of my desk. The paper went on top of the filing cabinet, and I went through to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and plugged it in, setting it to boil. Back at my desk, I checked the phone for messages, making notes on my pad of those that were important. I unlocked the filing cabinet and took out the dossier that I was working on. These were the accounts of one of my clients. I was a certified accountant, and this was my world. My name, well, it doesn't really matter as I went under a number of pseudonyms. At school, I was first called Jesse on account of my lack of height and body weight. I was only 5 feet 6 inches and weighed about 6 stone. I am still 5 feet 6 inches, but my weight has increased. Those who called me Jess were bigger boys, bullies all, who picked on me with impunity. I learned a valuable lesson there. Apart from the official lessons, I learned that the world worked on trade-offs. The bullies who didn't bother too much about studying would slip into a life of crime anyway, but still needed to pass exams. It wouldn't do for them to be seen as the dunces of the class. I applied myself to the lessons and soon found myself in a position where they needed my knowledge. An uneasy truce was forged. I helped them by doing their homework, making crib notes for exams, and they would pick on someone else, protecting me from other would-be bullies. Did I feel guilty that others became the target of their bullying? No. I grew up in the East End of London, a place with its share of the strong and the meek, with violence happening every day. Strength was not always muscle, and men learned early to use whatever talent they had to survive. People who were not Londoners might call me a cockney, but they'd be wrong, as I hadn't been born within the sound of bow bells. My dad was a dock worker, waiting in line every morning at the dock gates with all the others to see if the foreman had work for him that day. He was killed working in the hold of a ship when the net hoisting a load broke, and the contents, Brazil nuts, fell on him. Dock workers were always casual labor, so there was no insurance or compensation after his death. Mom worked 3 cleaning jobs to clothe me and make sure that when I went to school, I was properly turned out. My going to grammar school was an additional problem for her, as I then needed sports kits for cricket in the summer and rugby in the winter. She managed, often going without, so that I had what I needed. When I turned 23 and had passed my accountancy exams, she left. I suspect that she had a man friend all those years after Dad died and decided that having done her job, she could now have her own life. I could manage on my own. I never saw or heard from her again. In later years at school, the name Jessie was forgotten, and I became just Jess, possibly in acceptance by the bullies that I was of more use to them on their side than as the target of their cruel games. Those bullies had indeed taken up a life of crime and still call me Jess, as I now undertake to keep their accounts looking good for the inland revenue. They can't declare that the majority of their earnings come from the proceeds of crime, so I created businesses that could show profits for them to declare, while leaving them with most of their income untaxed and untouchable. I, too, benefit from the arrangement. My earnings are declared and taxed accordingly, although quite a tidy sum is tucked away in foreign accounts, safe from our greedy politicians. As far as the taxman is concerned, I am an honest accountant and very successful. I also occupy a position which could best be described as criminally diplomatic. London and all other large cities tend to be parochial. The bosses each define an area that they call theirs and sanction, or deny the plans of lesser thieves within their boundaries. The criminal fraternity, usually saddled with a volatile nature, are not good at talking to each other. So from time to time, I would get a request from Mr. Brown to discuss a problem with Mr. Green. I had been blessed with a calm and non-combative nature, so I could address the problem and find a solution. Gang wars are not good. They attract too much attention in the papers and from the police. Quiet diplomacy allows crime to flourish without attracting attention. Mr. Brown and Mr. Green are, of course, pseudonyms, as is mine of Mr. Smith. When they refer to me, I, of course, know their real identities as I went to school with many of them. Commissions received for these services form the basis of my untaxed safety net. Crime has changed over the last few years. Bank raids and attacks on armored vans are history now. Crime thrives on internet fraud, credit and debit card theft, and cloning. Most people walk around with thousands of pounds available to them in their purses or pockets in the shape of little plastic cards. My clients take advantage of that. It's almost a victimless crime, as the losers are the banks and the insurance companies. I do not kid myself. I am as much a felon as my clients, simply by keeping their confidence. Under UK law, conspiracy is just as culpable as the actual crime. Our system worked smoothly. I was beginning to doubt that I could say the same about my marriage. I was starting to think that Lily, my wife, had something to hide. I had no positive evidence for this, no details, no photographs, no mysterious calls, no unexplained absences. It was the lack of some details that brought about my suspicions. Accountants look at the details that others ignore. Credit card bills come in, and most people either glance at the balance and pay or ignore them completely, allowing the direct debit they've set up to handle the account. I examined every item closely, including the interest charged. If you believe that credit card companies don't make mistakes, you are living in a fantasy. Over the last few months, Lily had added to her wardrobe a rather nice dress and a very elegant suit. Even I could tell they were not cheap. At first, I was pleased that she wanted to look good for me, and she did wear them at social events we attended together. Mostly, however, she wore them to work, and they were probably of a higher quality than I would think suitable for work. It was curiosity that led me to see how much they cost. The detail that alerted me to a problem was that no charge appeared on her credit card statement, nor did the bank statement, a joint account, show a charge. There were also no large cash withdrawals to cover the cost. So, to all intents and purposes, Lily seemed to have acquired these clothes for free. If there's one thing I learned in my formative years, it's that you don't get anything for nothing. So how did she come by these items? It may be that they were provided for her work, as receptionists needed to look good as the first impression of their employer. The other thought that bothered me was that someone, probably a man, had bought them for her. Was there a trade-off somewhere along the line? If a man were to buy a pretty lady some clothes, it was usually with the understanding that at some point he would be allowed to enjoy her company in return. Was there another man in the picture? I couldn't say for sure, but this needed investigating. Some of it I could do myself, but for most of the investigation, I needed to find others who could help. I met Lily when I called upon a client. She was a newly employed receptionist, and she was perfect for the job. Pretty but not overly striking. She had a manner that made it a pleasure to talk to her. Her face was without guile and reflected her mood, smiling easily with those she spoke to, and she had a talent for empathy that drew others to her. Lily was an Essex girl, a term that has become a joke in the UK, but she was far from typical. Yes, she did wear stylish heels, but her shoe color always matched her dress, and she rarely wore white. If she danced around her handbag in the middle of a club, it was only to protect it from potential theft. I frequently visited my client and got to know her quite well. She wasn't overly intelligent, as I gathered from our conversations, but she was eager to learn and fill in the gaps in her education. She was an orphan and had been raised in a children's home, which explained some of her educational challenges. However, she knew how to present herself, always smartly dressed with immaculate makeup. I was surprised when she agreed to go on a date with me. I took her to a nice restaurant, and she was quite at ease, not trying to act pretentiously. Our conversation flowed easily, and we had an enjoyable evening. Other dates followed, including concerts, theater, and dancing. Lily was conscious of our relative heights. She was the same height as me and would wear flat shoes on our dates, although she wore high heels to work. I assured her that it wasn't a problem if she wanted to wear high heels. "Are you sure it's not a problem?" I asked. "I've been looking up at people all my life, and looking up at you is the best yet." From that time on, Lily wore high heels and looked fantastic in them. Her legs were particularly striking. I asked her to marry me, and tears trickled down her smiling face as she accepted. We honeymooned in a beautiful location, where Lily, despite her 25 years, became very enthusiastic about our physical relationship. I was 5 years her senior and had been fortunate to learn from a couple of experienced partners. It was particularly satisfying when she expressed surprise at my physique. Although my height might lead many to assume I was in proportion, in truth, I was no more than slightly above average. But on my smaller frame, it appeared larger. Lily's enthusiasm continued even after we returned to the routine of daily life. Accountancy is a dull and dry business, but pays very well. I could afford to support us both, but Lily liked her job and wanted to keep it. We had been married for 3 years when she changed jobs to work with a company in Chelmsford. She was again a receptionist, but as she explained, it was easier to get to work in Chelmsford than Stratford. The commute to Chelmsford from Abby's Roding took her about half an hour, whereas the journey to Stratford would take at best an hour. All this appeared reasonable to me, and I replaced her old car with a good used Volkswagen Golf so that she had a reliable vehicle for her commute. Lily didn't use her car for anything other than getting to work and back and shopping at a supermarket close to her workplace. We used my car for everything else, as it was larger and more comfortable, and Lily preferred being driven. The receipts for the services on her car were in my files, and I noted the exact mileage. I could easily work out her average weekly mileage and estimate the mileage her car should now show. One weekend, when Lily was in the bath, I checked the odometer. My estimate allowed for some extra journeys in the last 7 weeks, but Lily had managed to clock up about 400 miles more than my calculation. It wasn't a huge number, but compared to the average mileage worked out from the number of days between services, she was driving about 60 miles extra per week. Where was she going in those extra miles? It was time to get help. I knew where I could find Frank at 11 o'clock in the morning. He would be at the Starlight. It's a cliché, I know, that criminal bosses would own a nightclub, but there was a point to it. With so many people coming and going, who actually got to speak to whom, and what they discussed was very difficult to track. At this time of day, I was just an accountant coming to talk to a client. Frank had just arrived and was drinking his first cup of coffee. He poured one for me as soon as I came into his office. "Problem with the accounts, Jess?" Frank asked. Frank had started out as one of the bullies from years ago. "Nope, Frank." I shook my head. "I have a personal problem." "I know, but I'm not a plastic surgeon," he grinned. That was quick for Frank. I smiled thinly before continuing. "I need someone who can follow my wife and tell me where she's going." Frank's face grew serious. "You don't think she's—" "It's a possibility," I said. He sipped his coffee slowly and then nodded. "There is someone. He owes me a favor." Everyone owed Frank a favor whether they realized it or not. Frank had ways of collecting favors from the most unlikely characters. "I'll talk to him. Do you want to meet him here?" "Here?" I asked. "I can get him here this afternoon," Frank said. I thought about it and nodded. "Yes, Frank. That will be good." "He will be discreet," Frank assured me. "He will if he knows what's good for him," Frank added, pouring more coffee for both of us. "Jess, if she is being unfaithful, will you divorce her?" I had thought about that. No. If she fights, her solicitor would start digging into my finances to get her maintenance increased. I don't want anyone looking into my affairs. It could uncover things we'd both prefer were kept quiet. Frank looked alarmed. "I see where you're going with that. So what will you do?" "I'll cut her adrift with a monthly payment to keep her quiet," I said. "I could arrange for a more permanent solution." "Thanks, Frank, but no thanks. A body has a habit of being found. We don't want police swarming all over our doorstep. Besides, I couldn't do that to Lily." "You love her, then?" "Yes, I do. But if she's unfaithful, she goes. I couldn't live with her ever again." That afternoon, I returned to the Starlight. The man, named Vin, was waiting nervously. A summons from Frank usually had that effect. Frank introduced us. "Vin, this is Mr. Smith. He needs someone followed, and a full report of her movements, and who she meets." He paused for a moment, letting that sink in, and then menacingly told Vin, "Mr. Smith is a very good colleague of mine. I would be very upset if you tried any tricks." "Got it." Vin nodded quickly, nervous perspiration glistening on his brow. "Yes, Mr. Weston. Who will I be following, and where?" "That's a good question," I said. "It's my wife, Lily Martin." I wrote down my address for him. "I want her followed for at least 2 weeks to her work in Chelmsford and anywhere she goes from there. I want details of who she meets outside of work and home. If you can get photos, so much the better." She usually leaves home at 8:15 and drives a silver VW Golf. I handed him the registration number. He looked at the address. Abby's Roding. Great start, he said. It's about 6 miles north of Chipping Under, I confirmed. Yes, that's right. It's a small place. 1 car an hour is busy. Vin noted, if it's a small place, I'll stick out like a sore thumb. That's a good point, I said. She uses country lanes at first, but turns onto the A1060 just south of Margaret Roding. That's a busy road, so you should be able to follow her from there without being noticed. Leave it to me, Mr. Martin. Where can I contact you? Phone me at my office, I replied, giving him my card. He slipped it into his wallet and stood. I'll call you in a few days just to give you a progress report. When Frank and I were alone, he ordered more coffee. I can't understand you, Jess. You are the most solid guy I've ever known. Even now, you are calm and thinking things through. Don't you ever get angry? Yes, Frank, I do. In fact, I'm quite angry right now. But anger isn't the way to handle anything. You need to think things through before doing anything that could rebound on you. And you're going to wait. What will it be? 2 weeks, 3 or more? Vin will want a fee for his services, say, $1,000 a week plus expenses. What if he comes up with nothing? Then I'll be relieved that she isn't being unfaithful, but my gut instinct tells me she is. I continued as usual, fully aware of how people saw me, a quiet, inoffensive man in a charcoal gray pinstripe suit, carrying a briefcase. I encouraged this image. There are hundreds like me going to work every day, working at desks surrounded by paperwork, dependable and unremarkable. I liked being unremarkable, yet many of those men had secrets. For some, it was a small secret like reading magazines during lunch before going home to their families. For others, it was gambling or drinking. I had my own secrets. The first was my connection with the criminal world, which even Lily didn't know about. The second was that I was having Lily, the woman I cherished, followed. My logical, methodical mind had acknowledged the problem and come up with a way to gather more information. What if that information meant the end of my marriage? My brain gave me an answer, but my heart struggled to accept it. Lily had a special place in my life, not just because she was enjoyable to be with, but because she made my life more joyful. My work was meticulous and dry, but Lily lifted me out of that routine. Her joy and energy made our home life full of laughter and pleasure. If she was being unfaithful, that life would end, and the heartbreak would be overwhelming. Vin called me the following Monday. I have something for you, Mr. Martin. I can tell you over the phone. Where do you want to meet? I decided to prepare myself and asked him to meet me at the Starlight. Even if Frank wasn't there, the staff knew me well enough to provide privacy. I'll see you at the Starlight at 2:30, Vin said. Vin seemed apologetic. I'm sorry, Mr. Martin, but I'm certain that your wife is up to something. He referred to his notes. I followed her to work every day from Tuesday to Thursday. She worked all day, only leaving to get a sandwich from the nearby supermarket. On Friday, she left at 11:30 with a passenger. I followed her to Mark Tay, where they went to a hotel for lunch. They came out at 2 o'clock and drove back to work. I went back to the hotel and made some inquiries. They usually go there once a week for lunch. They have been dining there regularly for about 5 weeks. I did find out that he booked a room for one visit and spent a couple of hours in it, but I can't confirm if your wife was with him that day. It seems likely, though. Vin looked uncomfortable delivering this news, and I was equally distressed. Oh God, Lily, what have you done to us? I pulled myself together. How did you get this information? I asked. I worked in a hotel once, Vin explained. You don't ask the reception, you corner one of the porters. They know everything that happens and are usually happy to talk once you offer a few notes. Would they know who booked the room? I asked. Yes, the porters have access to the booking system, so they know where to take the luggage when guests arrive. Who is the man she is meeting? His name is Bennington, Louis Bennington. I recognized the name. He was the managing director of the company Lily worked for. I sat silently, trying to process this. Vin had confirmed that my wife had lunch with her boss regularly, advisable but not necessarily infidelity. If she had informed me about this, it would have been acceptable. Her secrecy made it questionable. Vin continued. Bennington has booked a private dining room for next Friday. It will be him and 3 guests. I could arrange for a friend to set up some discreet digital cameras. They could be placed in air conditioning vents and smoke alarms. Will they be visible? I asked. No, Mr. Martin. They are very small. They can record video and take screen grabs, though the signal doesn't travel far. My friend can upload the images to a computer. How much will this cost? Vin thought for a moment. Around $800 for the porter and $500 for my friend. I nodded. Do it. I retrieved my wallet. Let's call it wages for the week and expenses. That should cover your associate and the porter. I placed the money on the table. Vin hesitated. Mr. Martin, I'll take the money for expenses, but you don't owe me anything for wages. This is a favor from Mr. Weston. I looked up in surprise. Vin, I know how Mr. Weston expects people to do him favors. Your favor benefits me, and when someone does a good job, I believe it should be recognized. Vin took the money with a nod. Thank you, Mr. Martin. We left the Starlight together. He turned left, and I hailed a cab. The club was near Canary Wharf, and black cabs were plentiful in the area now, unlike a few years ago when they were rare. The influx of financial professionals had changed that. The cab took me back to my office on Old Street. I sat at my desk and stared blankly. My life felt empty now. In the future, I would take the train each morning, surrounded by indifferent fellow passengers, and come to the office to work with figures, all while carrying the heavy pain of what I had lost. In the evenings, I would return to an empty house, a place devoid of her laughter, presence, and voice. It would be a lifeless, dull space. Despite my logical mind telling me I had no proof, my emotions were telling me otherwise. She had allowed another man to be close to her, giving him what she once promised only to me. When I arrived home that evening, I felt unwell. I wondered how I could avoid being intimate with Lily over the next few days. Physical closeness and sharing our deepest emotions would be difficult to fake, and she would surely notice something was wrong. I didn't need to pretend. The closer I got to home, the more I felt sick, until I was genuinely ill. Lily was concerned. Have you eaten something that upset you? I don't think so, I replied. I had a kebab at lunchtime. She looked at me surprised. A kebab? Oh, Chad. You of all people should know that reheated meat is likely to make you ill. What made you choose that? My given name was Charles, rarely used. Lily didn't like the name. She said it reminded her of upper-class pretentiousness. The American equivalent, Chuck, was slang for vomiting in the UK, so that was out. Early on, Lily had started calling me Chad. I just fancied a kebab. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I tried to make a joke, but it didn't lighten the mood. Let's get you to bed. If you're still unwell in the morning, I'll call the doctor. I knew I would still feel bad in the morning, and likely every morning for some time. It was a pain I would learn to live with. Lily's concern was at odds with the image I had of a potentially unfaithful wife, which made it hard to reconcile. She fussed over me, providing liquids and keeping a bowl nearby in case I needed it. Her care and affection only added to my confusion. I could end this situation by confronting her about her lunch with her boss. But I couldn't be sure if she was meeting him on Friday, and pretending to be ill might only delay the inevitable. Fidelity is not a right, it's a gift given freely and unconditionally. I had given my fidelity to Lily with love and trust. My sad thoughts were that she had already compromised her commitment, even if she hadn't been physically unfaithful. The next few days were a blur. I went to work and made decisions, though I was consumed by troubling thoughts. My mind conjured disturbing images of Lily being intimate with another man, which gave me insight into why some might resort to drastic measures in similar situations. I tried to push those thoughts aside as I focused on other matters. My brain gave me an answer, but my heart struggled to accept it. Lily had a special place in my life, not just because she was enjoyable to be with, but because she made my life more joyful. My work was meticulous and dry, but Lily lifted me out of that routine. Her joy and energy made our home life full of laughter and pleasure. If she was being unfaithful, that life would end, and the heartbreak would be overwhelming. On that fateful Friday, I didn't go to work at my usual time. I wanted to see what Lily would wear to work. Her discomfort with my presence lingered longer than usual. "Do you still feel unwell, Chad?" "No, Lily, I'm fine." "Why do you ask?" "Well, you're usually out of the house by 7:30. "Oh, sorry, I didn't mention it. I have an appointment in Layton at 10. And it seemed pointless to go into the office for just 10 minutes and then come all the way back." Lily accepted my explanation. When she came downstairs, she was wearing a belted Burberry coat. I eyed the coat skeptically. "It might rain today," she explained, perhaps showing a hint of guilt. I wondered if the Burberry coat was an attempt to cover up something. She kissed me goodbye and left the house. I went upstairs and looked through her wardrobe. I noticed some dresses I didn't recall seeing before, which made me wonder if her secret admirer had gifted her new clothes. I found the dress I had seen when my suspicions first arose, but not the suit I suspected she was wearing. It seemed likely that she was wearing the suit today, and I thought that might be why she chose the Burberry coat. I left the house shortly after and went to work. Around 11:30, my phone rang. As usual, I didn't give my name when answering, just said hello and waited for the caller to identify themselves. "Mr. Martin, it's Vin." My heart raced. "What have you got for me?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I'm sorry, Mr. Martin," Vin replied, his voice carrying sympathy. The pain in my stomach intensified. "I see," I said quietly, understanding that my marriage might be over. "Mr. Martin, I'm here. Can you come to my office on Monday?" "Yes. What time?" "About 11. I'll be there." The tension over the weekend was palpable. Lily seemed unusually affectionate, but I couldn't respond. If she noticed my lack of reaction, she didn't show it, likely attributing it to the stomach bug I had last week. We did the usual weekend activities, shopping on Saturday, and I worked on tidying up our garden, a traditional Essex weatherboard house I had bought before our marriage. I focused on the weatherboarding, avoiding Lily's questions. Monday arrived, and I was apprehensive about what awaited me. The buzzer rang just before 11. I released both the top door and the street door. Vin arrived, and I welcomed him into my office. "Can I get you a cup of tea or coffee?" I offered. "No, thank you, Mr. Martin," Vin replied. He sat down, and I took a deep breath. "Okay, what have you got for me?" Vin produced a small sports bag and handed me a stiff padded envelope. Inside were numerous photos and a DVD in a case. "Mr. Martin, I suggest you don't watch the DVD right away. It's 2.5 hours long and contains content that will be upsetting. Mr. Bennington and your wife met with 2 other gentlemen at the hotel. They went upstairs to a private dining room and had lunch. I have their car registration numbers if you wish to pursue this further." After lunch, the staff cleared the dishes and left them alone. Bennington seemed to lock the door and poured more drinks. After about 15 minutes, your wife got undressed. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to detail what happened next. There are pictures, and you should review them privately. I am truly sorry." As Vin spoke, a cold, heavy sensation began to form in my chest, growing colder and heavier until I struggled to breathe. It felt like my heart was freezing. There were few words to describe the depth of my loss. I had lost someone I loved deeply, and the finality of that loss was overwhelming. The difference was that while the deceased would not return to haunt me, the memories and pain would linger. My sorrow was matched by a profound anger. I was angry at Lily, but my bitterness was directed particularly at Bennington and the two other men. Bennington, knowing Lily was married, had exploited her, showing no regard for her commitment to me. I resolved to confront Lily first, then deal with Bennington and the others. I cleared my throat. Vin, is it possible to find out where they live and whether they're married or not, using those registration numbers? That can be done, Mr. Martin. There's always someone willing to do a bit of extra work for some cash. A couple of hundred should be enough. I nodded. Thanks, Vin. I appreciate it. He assured me he wasn't trying to skim any money off me and that I could settle up with him once he had the information. We spoke a bit more before he left, and his final advice was not to do anything rash. I promised him I wouldn't. I skimmed through the DVD. I had never been a fan of explicit content, and seeing a film featuring my wife didn't appeal to me. I fast-forwarded through much of it, especially the parts where Lily undressed. I focused on the key sections and the comments made by the men, which further fueled my anger. I couldn't watch when she allowed them total access, as it would have been too much for me. The sound quality varied, but I heard one of the men, identified as Wello, speaking to Bennington. He asked where Bennington had found her, and Bennington responded that she was quite impressive. Haskins compared her to his own wife unfavorably. There was a discussion about the possibility of a repeat visit, and Bennington mentioned that Lily's husband was likely not much of a threat. I stopped the DVD. We'll see who has the last laugh, I thought. But first, I needed to confront Lily. I left the office after Vin had gone. Lily would typically arrive home around 5:30, and I wanted to catch her before she started cooking, which would have been too domestic for the conversation we needed to have. It was the middle of the afternoon when I opened the front door. I had parked my car at the pub, thinking that if Lily didn't see me, it would surprise and unsettle her. It was a misguided idea, as the evidence on the DVD was undeniable. I inserted the disc into the player and paused it at the moment they entered the room and took their seats. I selected only a few key photos from the ones Vin had provided. One showed Lily standing naked on the table, another of Bennington holding her legs apart, and the final one showed her in an intimate position with Haskins. I placed these in a separate folder. When Lily arrived at 5:25, she went straight to the kitchen to make tea. Upon entering the lounge, she stopped short upon seeing me. "Chad, you startled me. You're home early. Is something wrong? Are you not feeling well?" I raised my hand. Something has happened, and no, I am not well. In response, she suggested calling the doctor. "This has been going on for too long," she said. "Yes, it has, but the doctor won't be able to cure this. Sit down, Lily." She sat down, puzzled. I pressed play on the remote. The screen lit up, and the video began to play. I heard her gasp as she recognized the scenes. I let the DVD continue, hearing Lily's breathing become erratic. When she saw the footage, she started to hyperventilate and cried out, "No, for God's sake, no." Her hands covered her face as she sobbed uncontrollably. I paused the DVD and waited for her to calm down, but every time her crying subsided, she looked at me and started crying again. Eventually, she could cry no more. Lily couldn't meet my gaze, her face blotched and red, with tears still drying on her cheeks. She cleared her throat, trying to speak, but I interrupted her. "It doesn't matter how," I said. "What matters is that I know the DVD is 2.5 hours long, and you understand what it shows, everything." She burst into tears again. To give her a moment to recover, I went to make 2 coffees. I thought caffeine might help with this difficult conversation. I brought the coffees into the lounge along with a warm, damp flannel for Lily to wipe her face. She offered a weak smile of thanks and sipped her coffee. "I am so sorry, Chad," she said. I nodded. "Of course you are. But would you have been sorry if I hadn't found out?" She didn't answer, and I didn't expect her to. "What are you going to do now, Chad?" she asked. "I'm not doing anything. You are." "What do you mean?" "You're going upstairs and packing your bags. Tomorrow, you'll leave this house and never come back. Oh, Chad, do I have to? I love you so much. I opened the folder and selected the photo that showed her with all 3 men. I placed it in front of her. Is this how you show your love? I demanded. She began sobbing again. I left her alone for a while, needing to control my own anger. It was burning inside me, and I knew I would have hurt her if I let it loose. When I returned, she had regained her composure. Are you going to divorce me? She asked, fearfully. No, Lily, I'm not. Her eyes sparkled with a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly dashed when I continued. If you decide you like the life Bennington offers you, then you'll have to divorce me. I'll use these photos to defend the action, and the likely outcome is that you'll get nothing. Bennington will probably end up divorced as well, likely leaving him destitute. I doubt you'll have a good life with him unless he exploits you further. You seem to be good at that. Lily paled at the comparison to a prostitute, but didn't argue. I knew the DVD and photos wouldn't be admissible in court since they were obtained illegally. I don't really like him that much, I said. But why give him your body? I didn't ask, though, as it would invite explanations I wasn't prepared to hear. Why aren't you divorcing me? She asked. There's little point. I'm not planning to remarry. A divorce would cost me, and I've worked too hard to jeopardize everything. You can leave, but if you have any pride, you'll find another job and try to move on. I'll make you an allowance. From tomorrow, your cards won't work, but I'll deposit money into your account each month. You can keep the car. Lily was puzzled. Why are you doing this? I've loved you, and even now, I still do. But what you've done has hurt me deeply. You were concerned about my health lately. It wasn't a stomach bug. It was learning about your actions that caused it. I can't live with you anymore. Seeing you would only remind me of what you've done and make me angry. I gave you my heart when we married, and I can't take it back. Even so, my love for you won't let me see you in hardship. Besides, considering the years we spent together, I consider the account settled. We can work together to overcome this. Lily tried again to apologize. Oh, yes, I replied sarcastically. It's not we who have to overcome this, Lily. It's me. Watching you with those men made me physically sick. My wife, the woman I love, letting other men into her life, and seeming happy about it. The images are burned into my memory. The only way I could overcome this is with total amnesia. Lily spent the rest of the evening packing her things. Each time I went upstairs, she looked at me with hope in her eyes, but I couldn't change my mind. The images in my mind hardened my heart. She made a call to someone named Daphne and likely arranged a place to stay. I heard her descending the stairs, weighed down by a heavy suitcase. A week ago, I would have rushed to help her, but tonight, I wouldn't, and never again. She came into the lounge. I'm leaving now. One of my friends at work is letting me stay with her for a few days. I'll quit my job without notice tomorrow. She seemed hopeful I'd ask her to stay, but I dashed those hopes. It's a pity you didn't give notice a few months ago, I said angrily. Chad, I am so sorry. So very sorry. Please remember I do love you. I made no reply. She opened the front door, and I heard her sobbing again as she dragged the suitcase outside. The door slammed shut. I spent the rest of the evening in misery, going to bed much later than usual. The bed still held her scent, and my tears flowed uncontrollably. If there was any comfort in this, it was that Lily didn't say anything trivial like it meant nothing or it was only sex. How could any cheater come out with lines like that when the evidence was clear on the screen? I knew I had done the right thing, but it still hurt deeply. The betrayal had wounded me, and I had wounded myself in the process. When would it end? Routine and attention to detail had been the cornerstones of my life, yet in just a week, I had been late to the office twice. My news agent, Mr. Chandley, was so unsettled by my tardiness that he came out to question me when I arrived at the office the next day. Mr. Martin, Sahib, it is very unusual for you to be late. I have noticed this twice in the past week. I am concerned that my timepiece is malfunctioning. Mr. Chandler, your watch is perfectly fine. I have had appointments near home that I concluded first. Don't worry. The world hasn't changed that much, I reassured him. He looked relieved. I am glad to hear that, Mr. Martin. I see you haven't received your newspaper this morning. Please allow me. He rushed into his shop and returned with a copy of my usual Financial Times presenting it as if it were a priceless gift. I reached into my pocket, but he waved it off. No money, Mr. Martin. It's my pleasure. I trudged up the stairs with my faith in human nature restored, just a little. Later that day, Vin called. I just wanted to check if you're all right, Mr. Martin. Thanks, Vin. My self-esteem is bruised badly, but I'll survive. And Mrs. Martin. I'm sorry about that, but I suppose you had no choice. I agreed. Vin continued. I'll have the details for those two men shortly. My contact says that if the cars are registered to a company, he can find out more. Would you like him to pursue that? What does he mean? It's simple. He can call the company officially, and as a police officer, they'll disclose who the cars are assigned to and their home addresses. Vin, you know some very disreputable officers, I said. Only one or two, Mr. Martin, he laughed. Just one or two who might not stick to regular hours. I decided to focus on my research, which, although it might seem alarming to Mr. Chandler, was for my own purposes. I was investigating Mr. Bennington and the company he managed, Elwyn Dax and Company. I had two computers in my office. The main one, which handled my accounts and was not connected to the internet, and a second one for online access. I knew from experience how easy it was to hack into a computer. I accessed the company's records through Company's House. Their accounts provided useful information, although they were abbreviated. I noted the contingency fund, which acts as a company's financial cushion for unforeseen needs. It was either depleted to support profits or had never been substantial. Next, I checked Dun & Bradstreet for more details. Their reports, while summarizing available data, cautioned that they should not be taken as definitive evidence of a company's financial health. Their report on Elwyn Dax and Company was concerning. Further investigation was necessary, but I needed to go to Company's House in person. I visited Company's House the next day and returned to my office late in the morning. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of satisfaction. I had resolved to bring Bennington down, and his actions were helping me do so. I left a message for Vin with another task. He called that afternoon. Is there something I can assist with, Mr. Martin? Yes, Vin. Could you go to Chelmsford and observe the company where my wife worked? I need you to note down the registration numbers of their goods vehicles. They have about 25 vehicles that travel all over the country, but if you could get a good proportion of them, that should suffice. Yes, I can do that. 2 or 3 days should be enough. That's what I thought. Do you want me to find out who they are registered to? I was impressed. You're ahead of me. Yes, I do. Leave it with me, Mr. Martin. I'll get back to you in 3 or 4 days. My suspicions had been raised by the depreciation of the fleet. The claims matched the guidelines issued by HM Customs and Revenue, but there was no mention of capital expenditure on these vehicles in the capital account. Yet there was a consistent amount posted for servicing every year. These trucks were costly, and as they age, their servicing costs should rise. The fact that no new trucks had been purchased, but the servicing costs remained the same, made me suspicious. I suspected Bennington was involved in some form of financial misconduct. My days returned to a semblance of normalcy, but my nights were filled with despondency. We had always had a cleaning lady who came in twice a week, so even after a few days, Lily's perfume was no longer in the air. Still, there were many reminders of her. I would walk into her room and see a picture on the wall, one she had chosen with me. My eyes would moisten. The linen on my bed, washed, dried, and pressed, was a pattern Lily had admired and purchased. I would look at it and remember our times together, which led to anger and resentment toward her and Bennington for ruining something that once felt perfect. Then I would feel guilty for cursing Lily, because, despite everything, I still loved her. Vin came through with the information, a list of vehicle numbers. He had managed to get 18 of them, and best of all, they were all registered to a leasing company. Bennington and his company secretary were claiming depreciation and servicing costs on vehicles that the company didn't actually own. I suspected there were other scams at play, but I didn't have the time to investigate further. This false accounting was serious and deserved attention. I considered reporting this to the Inland Revenue, but I was wary of getting entangled with them. They were suspicious by nature and might scrutinize me as well. My accounts were in good order, but I didn't want to risk drawing their attention. Vin provided additional information. Your wife is no longer working there, Mr. Martin. I wondered if that was a relief. I needed documentary proof that the vehicles were owned by the leasing company, so I wrote to them pretending to be an outside auditor. I claimed that the copy of the agreement had been shredded, and I was too embarrassed to ask Elwyn Dax for another copy. 2 weeks later, I received the copy listing all the vehicles covered by the agreement. I researched the company through various online sources. Founded in 1897 to ship grain from rural areas to bakeries in London, it had led a profitable but unremarkable existence. After World War I, it expanded into general parcel traffic using surplus army vehicles. The grain business faded, and today, the company operated as general haulers and warehousing. It had never changed its corporate status, and its shareholders were mainly descendants of the founder. Originally held by 3 people, the shares were now divided among 22 descendants, with 2 holding just over 30% combined. These 2 were also directors, Lieutenant General R.D.R. Stanley and Mrs. T.B. Dax. Bennington and Jam Chambers, the company secretary, were also directors. I wondered if the General and Mrs. Dax understood their legal responsibility for the accuracy of the company accounts. Did they realize that overstating assets to bolster profitability could mean the company was trading while insolvent, which is a criminal offense? What to do with this knowledge? I planned to consult Frank, as I thought there was an opportunity for him to gain something profitable with minimal outlay. At first, Frank was skeptical. All this trouble just for revenge on this guy. I can send a couple of guys to give him a good beating. It's simple and straightforward. True, Frank, but unless they incapacitate him, he will recover and continue enjoying his lifestyle and position. Of course, there's the issue of it being GV8, which is just a bit illegal, I reminded him. My way will ruin him financially for the rest of his life. He might face some jail time as well, and what I'm doing is legal. Okay, Jess, I'll go along with you, but what's it going to cost? Frank asked. All I need is your name. I'll fund it, but I don't want my name on the documents. That could alert Bennington. At the end of this, you could have a going concern giving you nice profits. Damn you, Jess, you're going to get me going straight. I can see it now. Frank Weston, pillar of the community. My dad would turn in his grave. I had a similar conversation with Jack Ham, another client who led a lifestyle akin to Frank's. Frank knew I would approach Jack, and had no trouble with it. Jack, too, was willing to help, offering the same assistance as Frank. Again, I convinced him that my way was better. I wouldn't do it for anyone but you, Jess. You've always dealt straight with me, and your advice has been sound. Count me in. The reason I wanted another name was to avoid buying too many shares in one name, which could alert the major shareholders. The shareholders' register provided their addresses, and I wrote to the smaller shareholders, offering them a price for their shares that would make their eyes sparkle. I wasn't surprised at their eagerness. They had always received dividends, but not as much as they wished. The prospect of a few £1,000s for shares they considered mediocre was too tempting. Not all of them agreed, but enough did to give me clout at the next shareholders' meeting. The meeting was scheduled for March, primarily to approve the accounts and set the dividend. I gathered from those shareholders who agreed to sell that few bothered to attend. having inherited their shares rather than being serious investors. I wasn't surprised when I attended the meeting to find that the attendance was limited to Mrs. Dax, Lieutenant General Stanley, Bennington, Chambers, and me. Eyebrows were raised as I entered the boardroom, and I was asked about my business. I produced the written proxies from Frank and Jack. Chambers checked them and said, "Welcome to the meeting, Mr. Martin." Bennington suddenly looked alarmed. I could tell he was wondering if I was the Martin he had wronged. Stanley brought the meeting to order. The accounts were distributed for review. Mrs. Dax and the General didn't seem interested in reading them, confirming my assumption that they lacked a business background. I studied them closely, noticing that this wasn't the usual practice, and both Chambers and Bennington fidgeted uncomfortably. "Is there something you don't understand, Mr. Martin?" Chambers asked. "No, nothing at all." "Why? Am I holding you up?" "No, not at all. If you have a problem, perhaps I can explain," Chambers offered. I smiled. I was looking forward to this part. I handed Chambers my card. "As you can see, I am qualified, as are you. Accountants always check, don't we?" Chambers wasn't pleased. He passed my card to Bennington, who looked as if he had seen a ghost. Stanley prepared to sign but paused when I said, "Lieutenant General, I wouldn't sign those if I were you. You'd be committing an offense." "What do you mean, sir?" the General asked. "I'm sorry to have to tell you that these accounts are inaccurate, if not false." The General glared at me. "Mr. Martin, you'd better be prepared to back up that accusation." "We are wasting time," Bennington said loudly. "There are other matters to discuss." I ignored him and addressed the General. "Of course, sir. Would you kindly find the item referring to maintenance and depreciation on the vehicle fleet?" The General found the item. "Yes, it looks straightforward to me." "It would be, General, if the company actually owned the vehicles." "What do you mean?" I opened the folder and produced a copy of the leasing agreement. I slid it across the table. "Would you care to look at that agreement?" I then produced a list of vehicles covered by the agreement and slid it over as well. "That is the list of vehicles. I believe you'll find it comprehensive." The General reviewed the agreement and list before passing them to Mrs. Dax. The signatures on the agreement were Bennington's and Chambers. Both men looked increasingly uncomfortable. Their faces flushed. The General had seen enough. "Bennington, I think you have some explaining to do. We'll go into your office, and you can tell me what's going on." I didn't want that. The General probably didn't know enough about accounting, and Bennington would use his skills to obscure the truth. "General," I caught his attention. "This has been going on for years. An explanation for this year's accounts is insufficient. Without this asset, the company could be considered as trading while insolvent, which is a criminal offense. I would advise that the company cease trading immediately and have a full independent audit carried out." "That's not necessary," Bennington shouted. He and Chambers looked decidedly unhappy. "Be quiet, man." The General's voice took on a commanding tone. He turned and had a whispered conversation with Mrs. Dax. She nodded and looked at me. "Mr. Martin, are the General and I in danger of prosecution?" Mrs. Dax asked. "Yes, I think you could be," I replied. "Then I believe the General and I will vote to accept your proposal," Mrs. Dax said. She seconded the motion. Chambers noted the motion in the minutes and asked all those in favor. The General's and Mrs. Dax's hands went up, as did mine. With over 30% of the shares between them and proxy votes for 22% in my favor, it was no contest. I was leaving after the meeting when, by chance, I bumped into Bennington. He looked daggers at me. "Creep," he spat. I nodded. "It takes one to know one," I replied. "Don't mess with small-time bookkeepers. Some of us have clout now." Bennington had no doubt about who I was. I felt certain that the audit would uncover further issues for him to address. It was like looking from the precipice, knowing there was no way to avoid the fall. Weeks later, the independent auditors completed their work. As a shareholder, Frank received a copy of the report and brought it to me. "I can't make heads or tails of this. What does it tell us?" he asked. I read through it quickly, noting his distaste for the surroundings. "Why don't you get somewhere better?" he asked. "This place is a dump." I ignored that for the moment. The report confirmed all my suspicions. Bennington was involved in numerous scams, essentially defrauding his shareholders and the Inland Revenue with false accounting. The auditors had notified the Revenue, which had begun its thorough investigation. The police were already involved. Bennington was about to face the consequences of his actions. I explained the report and its implications to Frank. He winced. "I'm sure he'll end up in a place where he'll meet some of your acquaintances." He laughed, and I continued. "Frank, I stay here because it suits me. If I moved to more upscale premises, people would notice, and the tax authorities might get curious. The last thing either of us wants is for them to scrutinize my work. So I stay here, where they think I'm just an accountant with ordinary ideas. That suits me." Frank grinned. "I thought you'd say that. Now, what do we do with this company you've just ruined?" "It's not ruined. It's viable. I imagine the shareholders will be willing to sell their shares for a nominal amount. If you or Jack would like to take control, it won't cost you much. You get a profitable concern with operations across the country and possibly abroad." I added the possibility of international operations to see if it would catch his interest. It did. "That could be interesting," Frank said, leaving deep in thought. I decided it was time to add to Bennington's distress. Vin collected envelopes for me containing copies of the DVD and screen grabs. He delivered them by hand to Bennington's offices and other locations, slipping them through the letterboxes. The solicitors would be grateful for the business I was providing. The general phoned me a few weeks later. "Mr. Martin, my cousin Mrs. Dax, and I would like to thank you for your assistance. It looks like we will have to pay a fine to the tax authorities. But that shouldn't be too much. They seem to be directing most of their attention toward Bennington and Chambers. Could you advise us further on what we should do with the company? To be honest, neither of us is too interested in maintaining our connection with it." General Stanley, and I thought that perhaps my associates, Mr. Weston and Mr. Hallam, could be persuaded to take it on. However, with the negative publicity, it would need subsidizing for a while to get it back up and running. "If you could talk to them for us and see what they say. The shares are not worth more than a pittance now, so we will accept any reasonable offer." Vin had been proving very useful. He seemed to keep his ear to the ground. A couple of months had passed when he visited the office. This time, he accepted a cup of coffee and handed me a couple of newspapers. One was the Chelmsford Weekly News *. The front page reported on the problems at the long-established local company, Elwyn Dax Limited, and the Inland Revenue investigation. Another page had a ringed item describing Mrs. Ida Bennington's divorce from her husband, Walter, mentioning some photos showing him in an intimate embrace with a young woman. The other paper was the Southend Standard *. This article covered the abrupt departure of two executives, Mr. K.B. Haskins and Mr. Doewello, from a local manufacturing company. They were dismissed for bringing the company into disrepute and for activities unbecoming their status. The article also noted that they were both recently estranged from their wives. I thanked Vin for his thoughtfulness. I had achieved my revenge, but suddenly, I felt flat. While working toward retribution, I had been fired up and excited as everything came together. Now, I felt empty. It had been 12 months since I had insisted Lily leave. The year had been busy with my normal work and my extracurricular activities, leaving me little time to reflect on where my life was heading and what I would do next. At one time, it was simple. I would work until my investments abroad were sufficient, then retire with Lily to a better climate for a more comfortable life. Bennington and his cohorts had put an end to that dream. I couldn't envision finding another woman to share my life with. Once bitten, twice shy seemed to be the motto. Any woman in my life, however loving, would suffer from my lack of trust, viewing her actions with suspicion. This would erode any relationship, descending into arguments and mistrust. Deprived of my ambitions, I buried myself in the exacting world of accountancy. The general called me to say that Frank and Jack had declined to buy the shares. "Looks like we're stuck with them," he said. "You mentioned that the company was viable if run properly." "I did say that," I agreed. "Well, would you consider running it for us? I'd be willing to make you a gift of shares to give you an incentive, and I'm sure there could be a good salary as well." "General, I'm flattered by your offer, but I should tell you that accountants are not the right people to run companies. You need an entrepreneur, someone with ideas willing to take a chance. Accountants, by their training, are often incapable of that. All you need to do is look at the large concerns in this country that have failed. British Rail, British Steel, Austin Rover, all run by accountants." "I take your point. The bloody army is run by accountants now," he said bitterly. "Moving on, I was wondering if you would agree to join me for lunch. My cousin, Mrs. Dax, is as eager as I am to show our gratitude for your intervention. I believe you live near Chelmsford. Would next Tuesday suit you?" It was obvious that he was not used to hearing no, so I accepted. He gave me his address, which was just outside Danbury. He suggested that 12 to 12:30 would be fine. I drove over to Danbury in quite a good mood. It had been 12 months since I had asked Lily to leave, and during that time, I had not gone out socially even once. I quite liked the general. He was a bit of a throwback, but easy to get along with. He didn't need to act like an old soldier. He was one, and I was sure he had a wealth of interesting stories. His home was not quite what I had expected. I had envisioned a grand estate surrounded by a park, but instead, I arrived at a modest bungalow with a very neat, well-kept garden. He welcomed me at the door. "Mr. Martin, thank you so much for coming. It's good to see you again. General Ambrose is the label Chad," he said with a nod. "Short for Charles, I presume." He invited me in, where Mrs. Dax stood up to greet me. She told me to call her Terry, though her full name was Teresa. "I've been Terry all my life," she said. Ambrose got us drinks, and we sat down. "Chad, I'm speaking for both of us when I say that you have done us a great service. As you can imagine, I inherited these shares. The Army doesn't have much need for accountants, and I know absolutely nothing about running a business. Terry's husband was the last of the Daxes to take a hands-on interest in the business. When he died, Bennington seemed like our savior. We wouldn't have known what he was doing until the business crashed. I suspect that would have cost us a lot more than just a fine from the Inland Revenue." "Thank you." I made the appropriate non-committal noises over lunch. The conversation was light and amusing until we were having coffee. Then Ambrose asked the pointed question, "Why did you take an interest in our company?" I waffled a little, saying my principals were always interested in a potential buy-in. He shook his head in disbelief. "It wouldn't have anything to do with Bennington, would it? Or the fact that a young woman with the same name as yours left suddenly?" I raised my hands in surrender. "Okay, you've got me," I admitted. He grinned. "Is she your wife?" Terry Dax joined the conversation, her curiosity evident. I nodded. "But you're not together anymore," she said. "No," I confirmed, feeling her sympathy. Ambrose gave me a look of understanding. "That knowledge might help," he said. "It wouldn't," I replied. "She was in control of herself when she went to lunch with him all those times. I can't see how his actions made any difference. She shouldn't have been there in the first place." My outburst put a damper on the conversation. Ambrose picked up the conversation with an innocuous question. "You live quite close to Chelmsford, I believe." I gratefully accepted the change of topic. "Yes, I live in Abbey's Roding." "Oh, how lovely," Terry gushed. "The villages are beautiful." The conversation then centered on the delights of English villages as places to live. I was preparing not to overstay my welcome when the general made another intuitive comment. "Mr. Weston is a rather difficult man to deal with. We asked what I believe to be a very reasonable price for the shares, but he offered so little that to accept would be to give them away. I suspect he is a bit of a rogue." I smiled. "You may well be right, Ambrose. He's an East End lad, as I am. I think he does a bit of dodging and diving." Ambrose grinned. "I believe that's called being economical with the truth. We had quite a few like that in the army, always on charges for one thing or another, but bloody good soldiers all the same. The ones you'd want around when things were getting difficult." As I drove home, I reflected on what Ambrose had revealed. So Bennington was a serial seducer, and Lily was just one of his many conquests. It didn't change my decision. If his behavior was common knowledge in the office, then Lily should have been forewarned. She allowed him to take her to lunch over many weeks. She should have known his intentions, and her continued meetings with him seemed like acceptance of those intentions. Hearing that Bennington had been sentenced to 2 years in prison felt like an anticlimax. He would serve his time in an open prison, as he was not deemed dangerous to the general population, though he posed a risk to other spouses. What cheered me was that, in the divorce, his wife indeed took him to the cleaners. When he got out of prison, he would be homeless, likely penniless, and would struggle to find employment at the level he once enjoyed and misused. Vin could not find any information about Haskins, and well apart from the brief report in the paper. I was content. No, I wasn't. I was still without the one person who had once made my life happy, and they had done that to me. Fate still had surprises in store. The General and Mrs. Dax had kept in touch. While I wouldn't describe them as close friends, they were friendly acquaintances. Elwyn Dax Limited had resumed operations after the investigation. The Inland Revenue decided against applying for liquidation, but needed a strong leader at the helm. I had joined them that day to interview a couple of candidates for Bennington's position. One of them seemed particularly suitable, though either candidate would do well. After the interviews, we sat in the boardroom with a cup of tea and discussed the candidates. They both agreed with me on the CV of one candidate and wanted to make him an offer. I had to point out that the salary and bonus structure would need to be high to attract him. "I agree, he is the best candidate, but I doubt he would come here for the package you can afford to offer. The company is operating on a significant overdraft. Economies have to be in place until that's reduced. Perhaps you should consider Mr. Stinn. I think he will do a good job, and the company can afford him." "Chad, you have your accountant's hat on," quipped Ambrose. "I thought that was why you asked me to sit in." I smiled, and so did he. Terry Dax settled the matter. "I think we should listen to Chad. He's given us good advice before, and we should accept his advice now." Ambrose nodded in agreement. Terry Dax then changed the topic. "Chad, have you thought about your wife at all?" "No," I replied. "You should," Terry said. "I think she is just as much a victim in this as you were." "Why do you think that?" I asked. "From what you've said and what we've learned from the investigation, Bennington was a skilled manipulator. He was her boss, and as an employee, she would be inclined to follow his instructions. No one talked about his activities until the police questioned them, so it wasn't common knowledge. I doubt she understood what he intended, and I'm sure he spun a convincing story. If he used any sort of coercion, it's likely many would fall for it. For months, I had maintained that Lily was aware of her actions, yet Terry suggested a scenario that was entirely plausible. Lily was never subservient, but was very conscientious about her job and would follow her boss's instructions. If she had no inkling of his reputation, she might not have questioned those instructions. And then it was too late. With Terry's words in mind, I drove out of the yard and turned left. If I were to ask Lily back, would she repeat her past actions? My gut feeling was no, she wouldn't. There was a supermarket just a few hundred yards away, and on impulse, I decided to stop in and get some supplies. I particularly needed washing powder. My cleaner, Mrs. Selby, had taken over the washing after an incident where I ran out of powder and clean shirts at the same time. I used washing up liquid as a substitute. Bad move. I had to cycle the wash 3 times before getting the suds out of my shirts. Even then, they smelled of detergent for days. Mrs. Selby had different views. The powder drawer was quite big, and she believed it had to be filled. I couldn't understand why she was adding washing powder to my need list almost every other week until one day I happened to be home when she did the washing. Diplomatically, I showed her the little scoop that came with the powder, explaining the manufacturer's recommendation. Thereafter, I only had to buy washing powder once every 6 weeks. I picked up a basket and strolled into the supermarket. It was a shock to see Lily at the checkout. I thought it was Lily, although she was wearing a hat with a veil over her face. Were those fates taking an interest in me again, giving me a nudge? I did my shopping as quickly as I could and went to the till she had used. She was, of course, long gone by then. I chatted with the checkout girl. "The lady with the veil," I said. I think I recognized her. "Oh yes, Mrs. Martin," she replied. "She lives just around the corner. Comes in every day." "Why the veil?" I asked. "I think she has a skin condition. I'm not exactly sure. I've only been here for a few weeks." "You don't know the address?" "No, I only know it's Hathaway Road. But that's all." I came out, torn between brain and heart. My brain said, no, she's no longer in your life. Remember what she did. But the part of my brain that governs curiosity stepped in. What skin condition? Lily didn't have that when she was with me. Her complexion was completely healthy. Then my heart joined in, echoing Terry Dax's words. I found Hathaway Road. It was one of those long roads within easy reach of the town center, lined with Edwardian homes built for artisans before the First World War. Bow-front sash windows with angular slated roofs jutted from just below the first-floor windows. They had once been popular, well-proportioned homes, but now they seemed divided into flats and bedsits. The local council provided wheeled bins for rubbish, but as terraced houses, there was nowhere for the bins except the front gardens. The Edwardians hadn't anticipated a time when almost every family would have a car, so there was no provision for garaging space. The road was lined with cars parked on either side. Some seemed to have been there forever, judging by the flat tires, dirty condition, grime mixed with pigeon droppings, and detritus underneath them. I slipped into the first space that offered itself, choosing the nearest door. I knocked, and after a while, a woman's face peered around the door, which opened slightly. "Yes. I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for a lady, Mrs. Martin. Do you know what number she lives at?" "No," the woman said, starting to close the door. I quickly added, "She wears a hat and veil." The door opened slightly again. I've seen her walking down the road. She lives somewhere down there. She pointed to the right. "Thank you," I said as the door shut before I could get another word out. I got back in the car, debating whether to drive further or keep the parking space I had. I decided to drive further, hoping to find another spot. After driving about 200 yards, I started looking for a place to park again. I was lucky. A space appeared. Though there was broken glass on the road, I backed in and chose another door at random to knock on. After waiting a few minutes with no response, I went next door. This door opened, and a Pakistani gentleman glowered at me. I explained my quest, and the description of the lady with the veil softened his expression. "I don't know her name, but she lives just over there at number 316. I think it's the ground floor flat." I thanked him and crossed the road to find 316. At some point, the front wall of the garden had been knocked down, presumably to provide a parking area. Now it was just used for the wheelie bins. There were 2 bell pushes, one labeled top flat, the other with no sign. I assumed it was for the ground floor flat. I pushed the button and waited, feeling a fluttery nervousness in my stomach. The door opened, and we stood looking at each other. She was wearing the hat and veil. It seemed like 5 minutes before she spoke. "Well, look who the wind has blown in." "Hello, Lily," I said, feeling a mix of emotions. That's it, kick me out. And after all these months, just turn up on the doorstep with a "Hello, Lily." It was just a greeting. She shrugged. "I suppose you'd better come in," she said ungraciously, then turned and walked away. I followed, allowing the door to close behind me. The door to her flat was the first on the right, and she held it open for me to enter. The place was furnished in a somewhat makeshift manner with what looked like second-hand furniture, one chair, a small table, and an electric fire where the chimney breast used to be. To one side, with its back to the window, was a portable television on a low table. I looked around, then turned to her as she took off the hat and veil. I was shocked beyond belief. Bloody hell, what happened to you? Her face was a mess, resembling a plastic model that had melted. Great areas of angry red tissue covered her forehead and the left side of her face. Her lips had almost disappeared. She stared back at me with a challenging look. "I came to see what you had done, Chad," she said, her voice full of fury. "Well, have a good look. You only have to see it once. I will see it in the mirror every day for the rest of my life." The anger in her voice was unmistakable. "Lily, what happened?" I asked. "As if you didn't know," she sneered. "This is the result of acid being thrown in my face. Did you think it would look like this?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. "What do you mean when you said?" As if I didn't know. Her challenging stare softened a little. "Oh, don't act the innocent with me. You know bloody well what I'm talking about." "I have absolutely no idea," I replied, shaking my head sadly. "The man who did it said it was revenge," she said. "I thought it was you who had it done." I shook my head again. "How long were we together, Lily?" 6 years, 3 months, and 17 days, she answered quickly and confidently. I was shocked by how precise she was. "Did you not come to know me well in those 6 years, 3 months, and 17 days? Do you honestly believe that I would do something like this to you? Something so hateful and full of spite? Is that how you saw me?" Tears ran from her eyes, which couldn't close properly anymore. She shook her head. "No, I couldn't. But only one other would hate me as much as you did." "And who was that other?" I asked. "It was me," she cried. "It was me." Her emotion was real. "No, Lily, I didn't hate you. I hated what you did, but not you. Never you." She shuddered with sobs racking her body. I fished in my pocket for a handkerchief, thankful that I had taken a clean one from the drawer that morning. I offered it to her, and she took it, which brought on a fresh bout of sobbing. It took 10 minutes, or it could have been 15, before she seemed to get herself together. She handed back my handkerchief. "Why did you come here, Chad? You know you're bringing back all the hurt. I saw you in the supermarket. I wasn't sure if it was you, but the girl at the checkout told me it was Mrs. Martin. She also told me you lived on Hathaway Road, so I thought I would call to see if it was you, and if you were all right." She looked at me calmly, and I shook my head. "No, Lily, honestly, I don't know why I came to see you." One part of me said, "No, don't drag up the past," but the other said, "Go see her." Even as I crossed the road and rang the bell, I was still conflicted, and my stomach was tying itself in knots. She nodded. "Yes, Chad, that sounds more like the truth. I'm sorry for the tears. Would you like a cup of tea?" "That would be good," I said. "I'm as dry as the Sahara." "Come through, Chad. That is, if you can stand the sight of me," she said, leading me to the back room, which was her kitchen. "Thank you for the allowance you sent me. It's a godsend now, as I can't get work anymore. They take one look at my face, and I can see the rejection in their attitude." She went on. "I had to sell the car. I couldn't afford the running costs, and I needed the money. I could understand that." As she waited for the kettle to boil, she took some skin cream and applied it to her face. "Is that something the hospital recommended?" I asked. She shook her head, whispering something I didn't hear. "What did you say?" I asked. She faced me and squared her shoulders. "I didn't go to the hospital," she said. I exploded. "For Christ's sake, Lily, why?" Tears slid in globules over the cream and down her cheeks. "I thought it was you. I was so certain that you arranged it, and if I went to the hospital, the police would investigate and come and arrest you. I didn't want you to get into trouble. I had caused you enough pain without adding to it." The words tumbled out, leaving me struck dumb. She had endured the pain and destruction of her face purely because she thought I would be in trouble with the police. To say that I was astounded and humbled would be an understatement. "Lily, even if I had caused this to happen, you should have gone to the hospital. You needed treatment. Whoever arranged the attack deserves all the punishment that's coming. If you had gone to the hospital, at least the police would have had a chance of finding the culprit." I had to emphasize my denial. "Lily, it wasn't me. I couldn't do that to you." She looked into my eyes as if reading the thoughts behind them, then nodded in acceptance. "Exactly what happened, and how did you cope if you didn't call an ambulance?" It was a Monday, and I was getting ready for work when the doorbell rang. I answered it, and there was a skinny man, tall but very thin. He asked if I was Mrs. Martin. I said yes, and he said, "This is revenge." I seemed to recall a glass bottle in his hand as he swung it around, and the next thing I knew, there was this cold liquid on my face. Then it started to burn, and I could smell it. I knew it was acid. He ran as soon as it hit my face. I think I had closed my eyes instinctively. I felt my way back inside and tried to find a cloth to wipe it off. But then some memory about diluting acid came to me. I found my way into the bathroom and got under the shower. It was very cold. I think I stayed there for about an hour. I was soaking wet, my clothes and my hair were drenched, and I was chilled to the bone, but my face was still burning. When I opened my eyes and looked in the mirror, I saw a red blistered mass of flesh, all puffed up. I knew then that I would never look pretty again. Remembering and recounting the episode brought on her tears again. There was nothing I could do except put my arms around her. She used my handkerchief to dry yet more tears. My mind was in turmoil, yet suddenly from those swirling thoughts, a ray of light emerged. "Bennington," I said. Lily turned from pouring the tea. "What about him?" "Bennington did it." "How do you work that out?" she asked. "Can we sit down? I have a story to tell you," I replied. She told me to sit in the only armchair while she pulled out a dining chair from the table. I explained the whole situation with Bennington, Haskins, and Wello, what I had done to get revenge. As I told the story, I realized that Lily's initial reaction was both right and wrong. My actions had started the sequence of events that led to her injury. If I hadn't sought revenge on Bennington, Lily would not have suffered this despicable attack. What I did had ruined Bennington. He would probably go to prison, and I had to let him know that it was your husband who did this to him. I needed him to know. Perhaps he decided to retaliate, and you bore the pain, Lily. I am so sorry. I didn't think for a moment that it would rebound on you." "I don't see it that way, Chad," Lily said. "I'm pleased that you took your revenge. If it was Bennington, then what happened to me was an unforeseen side effect." "You seem to take it lightly," I said. Lily smiled faintly. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said, indicating her face. "This happened, and there is nothing that will ever make it better. I had made up my mind a while ago that she was willing to suffer all this agony alone simply to protect me from what she thought would be arrest and punishment. Her actions spoke volumes. Whatever she had done, she had surely paid more than her due. She had accepted disfigurement to keep me from supposed imprisonment. I owed Lily a life. Cautiously, I asked, "Lily, will you come back home?" Call it compassion, sympathy, guilt, whatever. I told you that I couldn't stop loving you, and I haven't. I wanted you to suffer as I was suffering. I wanted you to feel the pain that I felt, but never in 1,000 years would I have wished on you the pain you've borne. We will take you to a cosmetic surgeon and see what can be done. But please, Lily, come home with me. I want to take care of you." She shook her head. "No, Chad, I can't do that." She held up her hand to stop me from saying anything. "Let me say here and now, Chad, I loved you then, and I love you now. I would be over the moon to think that we could get together and it would be as before, but it wouldn't be. I hurt you so badly, It wasn't deliberate, but I destroyed something. I can't just walk back as if nothing had happened. You would still look at me and see this face, and why it is like this, and then your anger would return. That is something we have to talk about. We both have to understand. I've talked with Mrs. Dax, she continued, and she has told me some things that make me think I didn't know the full story. Mrs. Dax? I asked, astonished. Yes, she replied. I suppose you could say that I'm now acquainted with her and with Lieutenant General Stanley. After all, I interfered with their business to get rid of Bennington, and they now seem to view me as some kind of business advisor. What did she say? I asked. It would appear that Bennington was a serial seducer, Lily said. You, Lily, were one of quite a few. Only once he had been dismissed would anyone speak out about it. I would imagine that he was skilled with words and had a story that would pull you in. He invited me to lunch, saying it was something he occasionally did with all employees. He told me that the company was in difficulties. I thought he was wrong to say that. He went on to say that he had a chance to pull in a new client who would give us business on a regular basis over months, if not years. If he could get their contract, then the redundancies he had planned would not be needed. He told me that I could help him. I wanted to help. The only thing I thought was odd was that he always insisted we went in my car. That sounds right, I said. He flattered you, said you needed to help, and then laid a guilt trip on you if you didn't come through. You would be to blame if your friends and colleagues lost their jobs. As for the car, I suspect that Jag of his was easily recognizable, and if he was driving a pretty young lady around town, it would get noticed. When I said it like that, it sounded plausible. She looked at me to see if she had used the right word, something she would do occasionally when we talked at home. That little gesture really tugged at my heartstrings. Tell me, Chad, you seem to know the routine. Are you a serial seducer? She asked with a slight smile, a smile that used to be the highlight of my day, the smile that made my life worthwhile. No, Lily, the only person I ever wanted to seduce was you, I said. You seemed to know what he was doing, she said, shaking her head. You were the only man I wanted to seduce. She gave me a sad smile. But in answer to your question, no, I didn't. Not at the time. He said he was going to entertain 2 men from a company for lunch and asked me if I would act as hostess, making drinks, and being nice to them. Well, that was the sort of work a receptionist would do. That was my job. Only it was at a hotel rather than in the office. I had no idea he planned what happened. I've had months to think it over, and still can't understand why I was so naive. I needed to ask the difficult question. On the DVD, you seemed quite happy to take the lead in your own seduction. I'm sorry to ask this, but you seemed quite happy at that lunch. I think I was, she said. The talks with Mr. Haskins and Mr. Wellow were going well, although I won't pretend that I understood it all. It looked as if we were going to get the contract. I was happy, as I remember, very happy, and I suppose, flirtatious. They had been very nice to me, complimenting me all the time, telling me that my smile had made their day. Women respond to that. I don't know where the idea of taking my clothes off came from. I suppose I did it to show I appreciated their behavior and to make them happy. I didn't think they would interpret it as a sign that I was ready for something more intimate. How stupid is that? She said, shaking her head. Women know that if they take their clothes off for a man, he will get aroused. Yet it didn't occur to me. It never entered my mind. I believe he did plan what happened. Yet it didn't occur to me. It never entered my mind, she repeated softly. I believe he did plan what happened. I've been told he used a drug on many occasions, probably slipped into your drink. I suspect your euphoria, lack of inhibition, and muddled brain were due to that. Lily shook her head. No, Chad. I was making the drinks. That was why I was there. Not all the drinks. Just after lunch, he poured the drinks, I said. I don't think so, Chad, Lily replied. It was on the DVD. He poured the drinks on that one occasion. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Positive," she said. "I don't remember that." The full import of the possibilities opened her eyes, and understanding arrived. "The creep," she suddenly screamed. In all the time I had known Lily, she had never sworn. I wanted to clear up the suggestion that she might have gone to a room with him on another occasion. Was that the only time? I asked. "Yes," she said. "Thinking back, I believe there was a time when he was going to try something with another girl. I was told after that Friday that he had booked a room a couple of weeks before. I couldn't go as I was filling in for one of the secretaries who had gone home sick that day. God, I wish someone else could have been unwell that Friday." Lily's tone, when telling me that, was so matter-of-fact that I doubted she was telling the truth. Retelling the story was quite emotional for her, and she wept again. I wanted to comfort her as she muttered imprecations and called Bennington all sorts of names. I said nothing. The extent of his manipulations came home suddenly. Her arms clasped me. "Oh, Chad, I am so very, very sorry." My handkerchief came out again to dry her tears. I raised her face and kissed her. Her lips were thin remnants of those they had been before, yet I kissed her lips. Lily was shocked. "How can you do that? I am ugly and scared." "You are still the Lily I fell in love with. Yes, you were pretty, but I fell in love with the person you were, not how you looked. You are still that person. That person is beautiful, and I still love that person." Tears still ran down her face, contrasting with the smile she now wore. "Can I change my mind? May I come home, please?" "Yes," I said. "I want you to come home, Lily." She had not taken all her clothes with her when she left, and her wardrobe was just as she had left it. Her expression was wonderful to see as she ran her hands over the dresses and suits. She picked out one dress and one suit and threw them angrily on the floor. "Those go in the rubbish." I had wanted to throw them away but could never bring myself to open Lily's wardrobe. It would be like opening a box of sorrows. She replaced her cosmetics in the bathroom, although she remarked as she did so, "I won't have use for them, but I'm happy to see them back on the shelf." She stopped suddenly as she came out of the bathroom. "Chad, would you prefer that I sleep in the spare room?" "No, I wouldn't," I replied firmly. "I want you back where you belong, in our bed, sleeping next to me. This is no halfway house situation. We will make it together or fail together, but I don't expect failure. As far as your makeup is concerned, I'm glad it's back on that shelf. I have far too much space there for the last few months. We'll find a good cosmetic surgeon too, so you never know. You might have use for them again." Abby's Roding did not have such a thing as a takeaway food shop of any description, not even that British necessity, the ubiquitous fish and chip shop. It was well into the evening when I got Lily back home, so I drove down to the pub and asked Bernard, the landlord, if he could plate up a couple of meals. I had dined there often over the months without Lily, and he was happy to do that. We sat down together for the first time in 18 months. She was very emotional, but we enjoyed the meal. Lily washed the plates in the sink, her hands submerged in the hot, soapy water. Humming happily, she dried them and packed them back into the bag Bernard had lent me. For a while, she wandered around the house, touching chairs, tables, and ornaments. I watched fondly as she reacquainted herself with these familiar surroundings, knowing that I was right to ask her to come home. It was strange preparing for bed. We were both hesitant, finding little last-minute chores to address, postponing the moment, fearful that the spark had flickered and died with the 18 months apart. Yet when we did slip into bed, I rolled towards Lily, and she came into my arms so naturally that the time apart became insignificant. High emotion as we had experienced that day drained the body, and we were both tired. Making love was not a priority. Becoming a couple again was. Holding each other tight was one way in which we could do that. Taking Lily in my arms as we snuggled into the warmth of our bed was one of the happiest times of my life. It was pleasure, contentment, and joy all blended together as one emotion. Lily sighed heavily. 6 hours ago, I would have said that I would never enjoy my husband's arms around me ever again. Yet I am here, and he is here, and he is holding me as he used to. 6 hours for my life to change completely. Thank you, Chad. Thank you for being strong enough to forgive me. Thank you for loving me enough to overlook my appearance. And thank you for just being you, my strength and support. I moved slightly and kissed her lips. Silent tears were rolling down her cheeks. They are tears of happiness, Chad, my darling man. Happiness. Work was placed on the back burner for a few days as Lily and I reconnected in everyday life. I had made a few changes in the house, just moving 1 or 2 ornaments and taking down pictures that had become a little too emotional for me to live with. Slowly, unobtrusively, Lily found them. She didn't replace them where they had been before. She found another resting place. Without words, she acknowledged that our previous life was gone, and that we had to make a new one together. She was helping to build that new life. We didn't go out in the village, even with her hat and veil. She was self-conscious about the injuries to her face. When I did get back to work, the message service had plenty for me to do. Frank had phoned a number of times, and I returned his call as a priority. He was terse at first, berating me for not being there when he wanted to speak to me. Then his tone changed. "I see that Lily is back," he said. I shouldn't have been surprised. He knew that Frank has ways of keeping tabs on all those he considers useful to him. "Yes. So you are human after all, Jess. Glad to know that. Welcome to the real world. I hear she had an accident." "I wouldn't call it an accident," I replied. "Why? What happened?" Frank asked. I smiled inwardly. Frank's information conduit was not as good as he thought. Some pig threw acid in her face. There was silence for a while. Frank had seen the photo I kept of Lily in my office and had often said he couldn't understand how I managed to get a woman as good-looking as her. "Who did it?" he asked eventually. "I don't know. All she said was that he was a tall, skinny bloke. I do have my suspicions about who wanted it done. The skinny bloke would be Harry Splash. He's the only one who would do something like that. I'll have words with him and find out," Frank said. "When you do, let me know." "No, Jess, your way won't work now. You would balk at the punishment needed for this. Frankly, others see you as being on my team, and I have to maintain respect. I can't have others thinking that they can do this to one of my friends and get away with it." Frank never spoke about the incident again. I knew he would not have forgotten it. Having Lily home again soon became normal. At my suggestion, she would drive me to the station in the morning and collect me in the evening. I did this so that she would have the freedom of the car during the day. But apart from shopping, she wouldn't go anywhere. Mrs. Selby came in just once a week now, as Lily insisted that she would do all the housework. I suspect Mrs. Selby was surprised to see Lily back, though I gathered she was pleased. She was a generous soul and would regale anyone who cared to listen with all the gossip from the village, but to my knowledge, never told anyone about Lily's injuries. Of course, village life being what it was, most inhabitants knew anyway. The garden fence network worked very efficiently. Lily didn't flaunt it, but gaining confidence, she walked to the village shop once or twice without her veil. I believe she told those who asked that she had an accident with hot cooking oil. We had connected physically now, and one wonderful night, we shared an intimate moment. Clasped in each other's arms, slick with our perspiration, damp from the mutual delight, it was a revelation. I had thought that one or both of us might feel restrained because of what had happened, but there was nothing but love between us. Lily always liked to talk after these moments. Well, she liked to talk at any time. As we lay there recovering, I anticipated some words from her. Surprisingly, she was silent. Jokingly, I asked if she had lost her tongue. "No, Chad, it's just that I'm lost for words," she said. "This feels like our first time. Do you remember it?" "How could I forget it?" I replied. "You came to me and gave me not only your body, but yourself, the most precious gift anyone could give." Her arms tightened around me, an acknowledgement of the words of love. "You gave me yourself too, Chad. I couldn't believe that anyone could give me so much pleasure, but you did. I felt that tonight was another honeymoon's first night. It was, in a way. We chose a cosmetic surgeon, James Waterman, who consulted in Harley Street. He was expensive, but he was honest. He said that the burned tissue could benefit from grafts, and he could rebuild Lily's eyelids and lips. However, he warned us that he could not restore her face to what it had been. He asked why Lily had not sought hospital treatment. I explained that we were away at the time it happened, and Lily erroneously thought I was responsible, so she didn't seek medical help to avoid getting me into trouble. He was astonished. "Your wife must love you very much, Mr. Martin," he said. Lily replied, "I do, Mr. Waterman." Back in the car, we discussed the consultation. I was disappointed, but Lily was pragmatic. "Chad, if he can't repair my face to what I was before, it will still have a benefit. If I can look in the mirror and see what I am and remember why I am this way, my face in the mirror is a daily reminder not to trust those who are untrustworthy. I belong to you." She hesitated a moment before continuing. "It would be good to be able to close my eyes completely, though. They water so much." I understood her logic, even though I was disappointed that she would never be the Lily I had known before. The cosmetic surgery took about 3 months to complete. Lily was delighted with the results, although when they first allowed her to look in the mirror, she was horrified at the bruising. She spent 3 separate weeks in the hospital with time for recuperation after each procedure. There were some small scars, although Mr. Waterman had managed to hide these under her jawline and in the wrinkles under her eyes. The most important result for Lily was that she could close her eyes properly. She would never have eyelashes, but that was a minor issue for a woman. False eyelashes served well. She was also thrilled to have her lips back, a feature she tested frequently, demanding kisses at any opportunity. I enjoyed the testing as well. Mr. Waterman had been truthful, even with the grafts. Lily's face still had a bit of a melted look, something like the aftermath of a stroke. She would live with that for the rest of her life. Apart from my role as an accountant, Lily knew nothing about my clients and how they made their money. I thought some exposure of my work was needed, so we sat down one weekend, and I explained what I did and for whom, as well as how they made their money. She surprised me by giggling. "Did I say something funny?" "No, Chad, I just tried to picture you as a gangster." "Well, it didn't work. Please don't get upset, but you are the last person anyone would think is crooked." I smiled. "Good, that's the impression I want to give." We talked about my retirement plan. She got very excited about that. Where would we go? I thought Spain or Cyprus would do, wouldn't they? "Wouldn't they come looking for you?" she asked. I shrugged. "That will only happen if I'm not careful. I'll continue being careful, and in a few more years, we can leave it all behind us." She was pensive, looking around our home. "It will be such a shame to leave here. I do love this house and the area." I had thought about this as well. "Well, we could just buy a villa and spend the winters abroad." Her face lightened. "Could we, Chad? Would that be all right?" "I don't see why not. If that's what you want, we can go looking now. How do you feel about a holiday in the sun?" "I would love it. I can buy some tiny bikinis and get a good tan. Or even go topless, and if you're very good, I might take off the bottoms as well when we're alone together." She giggled mischievously. "Then you can have your way with me whenever you feel like it." She paused as a playful gleam came to her eyes. "Often, I hope." I thought I should book a holiday as soon as possible. The prospect was too enticing to wait for. I am aware that many men would not have taken an unfaithful wife back. That is their choice. I chose differently. Lily made a mistake and found herself in a situation she couldn't control. I've read enough about the effects of so-called date rape drugs, as Terry Dax mentioned, to understand that they affect people differently. Bennington was clever. He knew exactly how to manipulate his chosen victim and when to administer the drug. The outcome was that he paid Haskins and Wello, and I paid for his actions. However, Lily paid the most. There comes a time when ego and pride must be set aside. Compassion, humanity, and love should guide our decisions. Not every situation is the same, and my wife will live with both the physical and mental consequences of her fall from grace for the rest of her life. Some will say that once a cheater, always a cheater, but as with all aphorisms, it isn't written in stone. One evening, the local news featured an item about a certain Harold Addingham, whose body was pulled from the Thames by the river police. His injuries, according to the police, appeared to be inflicted before he went into the water, and seemed to be the result of an acid attack. 2 months later, another news report reminded me of my conversation with Frank. It appeared that a prisoner at Sudbury Open Prison had been attacked. The attacker used an ordinary table knife, stolen from the kitchen and roughly sharpened, to inflict wounds on the victim's face and neck. The injuries were not life-threatening, but the victim would be horrendously scared for life. The victim was identified as Bennington. I couldn't help but feel that poetic justice had been served. He had inflicted so much damage on others, both physically and emotionally, that the universe seemed to balance the scales in a way no legal system could. His actions had led to his downfall, and now he would carry the scars, just like Lily. It seemed that fate had intervened on our behalf. As time passed, Lily and I settled back into our lives. Our bond grew stronger, perhaps even more than it had been before. The trials we had faced together had not broken us. They had strengthened our connection. We made plans, and though her injuries would never fully heal, we found joy in the small things, the day-to-day moments that reminded us of how much we still had to live for. And in the end, it was not the scars or the pain that defined us, but the love that endured through it all. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.